I'm standing in the marble lobby of what used to be my family's crown jewel, St. Catherine's Medical Center, watching my stepmother Patricia frantically wave her manicured hands as security escorts her out. Her Chanel suit is wrinkled, her perfect blonde bob disheveled, and for the first time in 23 years, she's the one begging me for something. Just 6 months ago, I was sleeping on my best friend's couch, drowning in medical debt that could have bought a mansion, while Patricia told anyone who'd listen that I was financially irresponsible and always looking for handouts. Today, I own the hospital where my late father built his fortune and every single medical facility that bears our family name. The irony tastes sweeter than the champagne I'll be drinking tonight in my new penthouse office. But let me take you back to where this story really begins, because it didn't start with triumph. It started with betrayal so deep it nearly destroyed me. 3 years ago, I was Rebecca Matthews, a 28-year-old kindergarten teacher in suburban Chicago, living paycheck to paycheck, but genuinely happy with my modest life. I taught at Lincoln Elementary, where I'd been for 5 years, making $47,000 a year and loving every chaotic minute of it. My small apartment was filled with student artwork, rescue cats named after literary characters, and dreams of maybe saving enough for a house someday. I wasn't wealthy, but I was content, independent, and proud of the life I'd built without relying on my father's money, something that had always been a point of contention between us. My father, Dr. William Matthews, owned the largest private hospital chain in Illinois, but I'd made it clear from college graduation that I wanted to make my own way in the world. The relationship with my father had been complicated since my mother died when I was 12. He remarried Patricia within 18 months, a former pharmaceutical sales rep who was 15 years younger and had the emotional depth of a puddle. Patricia came with her own baggage, twin sons from her first marriage, Brad and Kyle, who were my age and treated our house like their personal country club. From the moment she moved into our family home, Patricia made it clear that I was an inconvenience, a reminder of my father's first life that she'd prefer to erase. She'd make subtle comments about how I looked like my mother, but never in a loving way, always with this edge that suggested it wasn't a compliment. During family dinners, she'd redirect conversations away from my teaching job, dismissing it as playing with children all day, while praising her son's mediocre jobs in sales and marketing as if they were curing cancer. What hurt most wasn't Patricia's obvious favoritism. It was watching my father gradually drift away from me. The man who used to read me bedtime stories and take me to father-daughter dances became distant, always busy with work or Patricia's social obligations. When I graduated from college, he offered to pay for graduate school, but only if I studied business or medicine, something practical that could contribute to the family legacy. When I chose education instead, he withdrew the offer entirely, telling me I was wasting my potential and would regret being so stubborn. Patricia stood behind him during that conversation, her arms crossed, wearing this satisfied smile like she'd finally won some invisible war. I moved out that same week, determined to prove I could succeed without their approval or their money, but the damage to our relationship felt irreparable. For 6 years, I maintained minimal contact with them, showing up for obligatory holiday dinners where Patricia would make passive-aggressive comments about my little job and wonder aloud when I'd grow up and join the real world. My father would sit silently, occasionally glancing at me with what I hoped was regret, but never defending me or challenging his wife's behavior. The worst part was watching how differently he treated Patricia's sons. Brad got a job at the hospital's administrative office despite having no relevant experience, while Kyle was given a company credit card and a luxury apartment while he figured out his career path. Meanwhile, I was paying my own student loans and celebrating when I could afford name-brand groceries. I told myself I didn't care, that I was happier without their toxic dynamic, but deep down, I was still that 12-year-old girl desperately missing her father's love and approval. Everything changed on a rainy Tuesday in October when I collapsed during my second grade class's math lesson. One moment I was helping Emma with her addition problems, and the next I was waking up in an ambulance with paramedics asking me questions I couldn't process. The emergency room doctors at Northwestern Memorial ran test after test, their faces growing more serious with each result. Dr. Sarah Chin, the attending physician, finally sat me down with news that would shatter my world. I had a rare autoimmune condition called catastrophic antiphospholipid syndrome, and without immediate aggressive treatment, I had maybe 6 months to live. The treatment protocol was extensive: immunosuppressive therapy, blood thinners, regular plasmapheresis sessions, and would cost approximately $850,000 over the next 2 years. My teacher's insurance would cover about $3,000 of it. The financial reality hit me like a freight train before the medical diagnosis even fully sank in. I spent 3 days in the hospital while doctors stabilized my condition, and each day brought a new parade of billing specialists, insurance coordinators, and financial counselors who spoke in apologetic tones about payment plans and hardship programs. My teaching salary of $47,000 suddenly felt microscopic against a treatment cost that exceeded what most people earn in 2 decades. I called my insurance company 17 times, pleading with representatives who sounded genuinely sorry but explained that experimental treatments for rare conditions fell into a coverage gray area that basically meant I was on my own. The social worker, a kind woman named Margaret who'd clearly had this conversation too many times, gently suggested I might want to reach out to family members who could help, but I'd spent 6 years building walls between myself and the Matthews money, and my pride felt more important than my survival. For 2 weeks, I tried everything I could think of before swallowing that pride. I created a GoFundMe page that raised $3,400 from fellow teachers, former students' parents, and strangers who were moved by my story. I applied for medical grants, contacted pharmaceutical companies about compassionate use programs, and even considered selling my car and moving back in with my college roommate in her studio apartment. But the math was ruthless. Even with every possible discount and payment plan, I was looking at financial ruin that would follow me for the rest of my life, however long that might be. My doctor was pressuring me to start treatment immediately, warning that each day of delay decreased my chances of successful remission. Finally, on a Thursday evening when I was too exhausted to cry anymore, I picked up my phone and called my father for the first time in 8 months. The conversation started awkwardly, with my father's secretary initially screening the call because he was in important meetings. When he finally got on the line, his voice had that distant, professional tone he'd used with me since college, polite but not warm. I explained my diagnosis as clinically as possible, focusing on the medical facts rather than my terror, but when I got to the financial reality, my voice finally cracked. I wasn't asking for charity, I explained, but for a loan that I'd pay back even if it took my entire lifetime. There was a long silence on his end, and then he said the words that would haunt me for months. "Rebecca, you made your choice to be independent. You can't have it both ways. You can't reject the family when things are good and come running back when you need something." I tried to explain that this wasn't about wanting things both ways. This was about literally dying, but he'd already made up his mind. What happened next was worse than outright rejection. It was a masterclass in manipulation disguised as family concern. My father arranged for a family meeting at their house the following Sunday, supposedly to discuss options for helping me. I arrived hopeful, thinking maybe he'd had time to process the gravity of my situation and wanted to find a way forward together. Patricia greeted me at the door wearing her church dress, and that sympathetic expression she'd perfected for funeral home visits, immediately launching into how worried sick they'd all been about me. The living room was set up like an intervention, with Patricia, Brad, Kyle, and my father arranged in a semicircle while I sat alone on the ottoman like I was about to be sentenced. For 30 minutes, they took turns explaining how my lifestyle choices had led to this crisis, how I'd been too proud to accept their guidance, and how my insistence on being independent had consequences. Patricia was particularly brutal, speaking in that soft, concerned voice that made her cruelty sound like compassion. She talked about how she'd always worried about my financial decisions, how teaching was admirable but impractical, and how my refusal to join the family business showed I didn't understand real responsibility. Brad and Kyle nodded along like bobbleheads, occasionally adding their own observations about how I'd always been stubborn and never listened to advice. My father sat quietly through most of it, occasionally glancing at me with what I now realize was guilt, but never once defending me or challenging their narrative. The meeting concluded with their generous offer they would help me with my medical expenses, but only if I agreed to quit teaching, move back home, and take a position at the hospital where they could keep an eye on my finances and make sure this never happened again. The conditions were humiliating and clearly designed to strip away every piece of independence I'd fought to maintain. I would live in my childhood bedroom, hand over my paycheck to Patricia for budgeting assistance, attend weekly family dinners where my progress would be evaluated, and essentially become their charity case in exchange for medical care. Patricia smiled while delivering these terms, explaining how this arrangement would be good for everyone and help me learn responsibility. When I asked what would happen if I refused, my father finally spoke up, his voice flat and final. Then you'll handle this situation the same way you've handled everything else in your adult life, completely on your own. I left that house knowing that my family viewed my terminal diagnosis not as a tragedy, but as vindication of their belief that I'd always been the problem, the ungrateful daughter who finally got what she deserved for refusing to fall in line. I chose to die on my own terms rather than live as their prisoner. The decision sounds dramatic now, but in that moment, it felt like the only way to preserve whatever dignity I had left. I walked out of that house and drove straight to Northwestern Memorial, where I met with Dr. Chin and signed papers agreeing to start treatment immediately, knowing full well that I was essentially signing my financial death warrant along with hopefully postponing my physical one. The treatment began 3 days later, 6 hours of plasmapheresis twice a week, daily immunosuppressive medications that cost $400 per pill, and weekly monitoring appointments that racked up charges faster than I could process them. I took out a second mortgage on my tiny apartment, maxed out every credit card I could qualify for, and watched my credit score plummet like a stone thrown off a cliff. The physical toll of treatment was nothing compared to the emotional devastation of watching my family's reaction to my choice. Within a week of starting therapy, Patricia began what I can only describe as a whisper campaign throughout their social circle. Suddenly, I was getting calls from family friends checking on me, but really fishing for details about my situation. Patricia had apparently been telling people that I was too proud to accept help and had chosen financial ruin over family reconciliation. She painted herself as the concerned stepmother who had tried everything to bring me back into the fold, while I was the stubborn, ungrateful daughter who preferred martyrdom to admitting I was wrong. The worst part was that some people believed her version of events, reaching out with well-meaning advice about swallowing my pride and letting family help me. My father's silence during this period was perhaps more crushing than Patricia's active sabotage. He never called to check on my treatment progress, never asked how I was handling the financial stress, never once reached out to see if I was even still alive. I learned through mutual acquaintances that he knew exactly how much my treatment cost. Apparently, Patricia had done research and was sharing the numbers with anyone who'd listen, always with that sympathetic head shake and comment about how unnecessary this whole situation was. Meanwhile, I was working extra tutoring jobs between treatment sessions, selling everything I owned of value, and sleeping about 3 hours a night because the financial anxiety was worse than the physical symptoms of my disease. The breaking point came during my nephew's high school graduation party in June. I hadn't been invited, of course, but my cousin Maria called to tell me what had happened there because she was so disgusted she couldn't keep it to herself. Patricia had apparently been holding court on the patio, surrounded by relatives and family friends, dramatically explaining how heartbroken the family was about my situation. She told them I was drowning in debt and too sick to work properly, painting this picture of me as a tragic figure who'd brought everything on myself through stubbornness and poor choices. The most devastating part was when she mentioned that I'd been asking around about selling my mother's jewelry, the only things of value I had left, and Patricia had sighed deeply and said, "I just don't understand why she won't let us help her. William is beside himself with worry, but what can you do when someone is determined to self-destruct?" What Maria told me next made my blood run cold with rage. My father had been standing right there during Patricia's performance, nodding along sadly, accepting condolences from relatives who thought he was dealing with a difficult, mentally unstable daughter. But the real kicker was when Brad had joined the conversation, sharing his own insights about my psychological issues and suggesting that my illness might be stress-related because I'd never learned to handle adult responsibilities. Kyle had added that they'd all seen this coming because I'd always been dramatic and needed to be the center of attention. My father had listened to his stepson psychoanalyze and diminish me, his actual daughter who was fighting for her life, and said absolutely nothing in my defense. Maria said she'd finally had enough and told them all exactly what she thought of their family meeting solution, but the damage was done. They'd successfully rewritten the narrative so that I was the villain in my own medical crisis. That night, something inside me shifted permanently. I realized that I'd been holding on to hope that my father would eventually come around, that somewhere beneath Patricia's influence was the man who used to take me for ice cream after doctor visits and tell me I was brave. But that man was either gone or had never really existed in the first place. I was completely alone in this fight, and my family wasn't just refusing to help. They were actively working to make sure everyone knew that my suffering was my own fault. I sat in my empty apartment, surrounded by medical bills and collection notices, and made a decision. If I was going to survive this, I had to stop thinking like the daughter who still craved their approval and start thinking like the warrior I'd been forced to become. I had nothing left to lose, which meant I finally had the freedom to fight as dirty as they were. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in September, exactly 11 months after my diagnosis. I was sitting in the hospital's financial aid office, trying to negotiate yet another payment plan extension, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Matthews and Associates Legal, which was my father's law firm, and for a split second, I thought maybe he'd finally decided to help. Instead, it was Thomas Harrison, the senior partner who'd handled our family's legal affairs for 30 years, and his voice carried a weight that made my stomach drop. My father had suffered a massive heart attack the night before and died en route to his own hospital. He was 58 years old, and according to Thomas, he'd been working late in his office when it happened, alone, just like he'd left me to face my illness alone. The funeral was a nightmare of fake sympathy and barely concealed greed. Patricia played the grieving widow perfectly, draped in designer black and accepting condolences with practiced grace, while Brad and Kyle flanked her like bodyguards protecting their inheritance. I sat in the back row, still weak from my latest round of treatments, watching this woman who'd spent years poisoning my relationship with my father now positioning herself as his devoted life partner. During the service, Patricia spoke about their beautiful love story and how my father's greatest joy was providing for his family, a statement that felt like a slap across my face given how he'd abandoned me in my darkest hour. When the pastor asked if anyone else wanted to share memories, Patricia's eyes found mine across the crowd with a look that clearly said, "Don't you dare," and I realized that even in death, my father belonged more to her than to me. The real shock came a week later at the reading of the will. Thomas had called me personally to insist I attend, which surprised me since I'd assumed my father had written me out of everything years ago. Patricia arrived with Brad and Kyle, all three of them dressed like they were attending a board meeting, clearly expecting to divide up an empire worth approximately $47 million. The first part of the will was exactly what everyone anticipated. Patricia received the family home, a substantial life insurance payout, and various personal assets. Brad and Kyle each got trust funds worth $2 million and guaranteed positions in the hospital administration. I braced myself to hear that I'd been left nothing, or maybe some token amount with conditions attached, something that would let Patricia continue her narrative about my father's disappointment in me. Instead, Thomas cleared his throat and announced that the bulk of my father's estate, including his entire stake in Matthews Medical Group, which consisted of 7 hospitals, 12 urgent care clinics, and various medical real estate holdings, had been left to me. The room went dead silent except for the sound of Patricia's sharp intake of breath. Thomas continued reading, explaining that my father had established this will 2 years earlier, shortly after my diagnosis, and had never changed it despite what his family might have assumed. There were conditions, of course. I had to survive my illness and take active control of the companies within 18 months of his death, or the assets would default to a medical research foundation. But if I met those requirements, I would inherit everything he'd built, while Patricia and her sons would receive exactly what they'd already been given and nothing more. Patricia's mask slipped completely. She stood up so fast her chair toppled backward. Her face flashed with rage, demanding to know how this was possible. Thomas calmly explained that my father had specifically requested this arrangement be kept confidential until after his death, and that he'd been very clear about his reasoning in a letter he'd written to accompany the will. With Patricia screaming about undue influence and mental incompetence, Thomas opened the sealed envelope and read my father's final words to me aloud. "Rebecca," the letter began, "I know I failed you when you needed me most, and I know I let fear and weakness guide my decisions when I should have been guided by love. You chose to fight for your life without compromising your principles, and that courage reminded me of your mother and everything I'd forgotten about what real strength looks like. Patricia and her sons have never had to earn anything or fight for anything. This inheritance would only enable their entitlement. You've already proven you have the character to deserve everything I built, and I pray that by the time you read this, you've also beaten the illness that revealed just how much stronger you are than all of us." The aftermath was swift and brutal. Patricia immediately contested the will, claiming my father had been manipulated and wasn't of sound mind when he'd written it. She hired 3 different law firms, convinced that her years of marriage and the boy's expectation of inheritance would override a document written by a man she now claimed had obviously been suffering from some kind of mental breakdown. But Thomas had anticipated this fight and had documentation showing my father's repeated meetings about estate planning, medical evaluations confirming his mental competency, and detailed notes about his reasoning for these decisions. Meanwhile, I was dealing with my own shock, not just at inheriting a fortune, but at discovering that my father had been watching my struggle from afar and had seen something in my response that I'd never seen in myself. As Patricia's legal challenges crumbled one by one, I realized that the man I'd thought had abandoned me had actually been preparing to give me the ultimate vindication. Now I just had to decide what to do with the power he'd left me, and whether the family that had written me off as a failure was about to learn exactly what kind of person they'd been dealing with all along.